So thank you for joining us yet again for another Western Rivers Action Network webinar. We've been talking a lot lately about Minute 323, the new update to the Colorado River Agreement between the United States and Mexico. Today we want to talk a little bit about some of the tools that are going to make that agreement work, specifically system conservation projects and efforts to manage our excess water. To talk us through these topics, we are joined by Kevin Moran. He is the Senior Director of the Environmental Defense Fund's Colorado River Program. And we have Amy McCoy, Director of AMP Insights. Kevin and Amy, do we have you both on the line?
Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone.
We've got Amy. Do we have Kevin? Kevin, it looks like you got your phone line muted there. All right, are we starting with you, Amy?
Hi, Steve, it's Kevin. Can you hear me now?
Hey, Kevin, there you are. Yes, sir. Cool, so I've got things fired up here. I'm not sure which one of you is speaking first.
I think Kevin's going to kick us off.
All right, Kevin, just let me know when you want me to change the slides and we're good to go.
Okay, Steve.
Did I lose you again there, Kevin? Sorry about this, folks. Just give us a quick second while we figure out what's going on.
Steve, can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, well, very good. And I apologize, Steve. I'm on the line with my phone.
And Kevin, we've lost you again. I think you're going to need to use your computer audio.
Steve?
Yes, sir.
Okay, does this work?
There we go. Yep.
Really sorry about the technical difficulties. Well, hello everyone. And Steve, thank you to you and Arizona Audubon and the WRAN network for this opportunity.
Of course.
Really excited by the opportunity for Amy and I to have a conversation with the participants about reducing lower basin shortage risk in the Colorado River Basin and increasing resilience in Arizona and in our water management, and talking about both goals and some really important water policy and regulatory issues that we want to put forward to the group as issues that need to be addressed in the near term as vital for advancing Arizona's water management and resilience. So with that, let's go ahead to the next slide. So the approach that you're going to hear about from Amy and me obviously reflects all three of these dimensions and more. It's really, the way we think about this work right now is, thinking of ourselves and hopefully everyone on this call as, citizens of the Colorado River Basin, Arizonans who care about our state, about reliable water supplies for our future and the environment. And we're part of a growing number of people, a growing number of sectors and interests that are raising their voices so that we have sustainable water policy and we have greater resilience in our water management for people and nature going forward. So we're part of that, and in our own ways, everyone on the call is as well. To make the kind of changes that we're going to talk about and to have sustainable water policy, we obviously have to work in the arena of partnerships, of working collaboratively with lots of different stakeholders. We have to have some vision. We have to be able to to be able to articulate what we stand for and why. And then, of course, working on the ground on projects that really embody the vision and which have a certain management benefit or benefit to the environment in terms of a restoration project, for example, but projects which also point the way to a sustainable future for the region. So we want to work in all three dimensions and hope to hear your thoughts and questions about any or all of those. Next slide. So in the area of partnerships, why don't we go ahead and do the next slide, Steve? Wanted to just let everybody know that the organizations that are on this slide are all working together and also with other groups on really the core ideas and the approach and the policy proposals you're going to hear about in this call. So Audubon, Arizona, Western Resource Advocates, American Rivers, and Environmental Defense Fund. We're working together, doing what the professional development people call storming and norming, and now hopefully we are performing. You know, we've gone through a process of working together and developing a joint strategy and an approach to make a difference on Arizona water management by being one of that wider segment of the population and interest groups that have a voice and have a real impact on policy. I also want to point out another organization, well, two other groups as examples. One, of course, are a variety of the hunter and angler groups in the state of Arizona, where Audubon, Arizona, and WRAN are key liaisons, and where we really want to be informed by and guided by the hunter and angler community wherever possible, as part of having a big tent approach, multiple stakeholders needed to make change. Another organization I would mention is an organization called Business for Water Stewardship. Business for Water Stewardship is a project overseen by Bonneville Environmental Foundation. It is a network of over 1,000 businesses and business organizations across the Colorado River Basin, both Upper Basin and Lower Basin, that's working to educate and engage businesses on promoting sustainable water management and how water is central to the livelihood of nature, people, and the economic vitality of the region. So they're another organization I wanted to call out. Go ahead, Steve.
Sure. And let me interrupt you for a quick second, Kevin. I've gotten a couple folks on the line saying there's a whole lot of background noise coming from your end.
Okay.
Do you have any means of reducing that at all?
I will try to move. Just a moment.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Just bear with us for a moment, folks, while we get him to relocate a little bit.
If you can bear with me for a minute, I'm going to make sure I get to a quiet spot.
Sure thing. Thank you, Kevin.
And apologies for this. I had to be remote from my quiet office in order to get another of those meetings at the state capitol that some of us spent time on and want to be present for. So apologies for that.
Well, we appreciate you being there, so we're happy
I'm going to mute and be back in 1 minute.
You got it. All right. Sorry, everyone on the line. We'll be just a second, and we will be back up and hopefully a little bit clearer and quieter than we were.
Well, Steve, I have to ask if this is any better.
Barely, but if it's what you can do, we'll work with it.
Okay. So on this slide, what you see here is what I would call a 3 consensus messages of the organizations that are working together, including Arizona Audubon, how we're working together related to improving Arizona water management and policy. And we view these as touchstone messages right now. So, and really useful across a broad range of audiences, whether you're talking to a state legislator a city council member who manages a water supply, a natural resource manager. We think these are really, really useful messages that resonate across broad audiences. But the first is talking about our water supplies are a bank account, and from which we're withdrawing more than we can deposit. And if our state doesn't act responsibly and take action now, future generations could see our rivers run dry. Secondly, diminishing groundwater supplies are a major problem throughout the state of Arizona. And right now we have no idea how much groundwater is actually being withdrawn across the state. That's especially true, as many of you know, outside the active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas. We must develop plans to manage our groundwater so that we don't run out. And thirdly, it's essential to maintain secure water supplies for cities, farms, and ranches, businesses, as well as wildlife habitat needs. If we don't do something to protect our natural river corridors, it will negatively impact our state's outdoor recreation and hunting. So we think these are our touchstone messages, and for your consideration and use as you engage on issues that you care about in your areas. Let's go ahead. Go ahead, Steve. So part of the vision that guides the work of these organizations is the reality that we all face of the structural deficit in the lower basin of the Colorado River. It's become a warning and a call to action for people across the whole region to address that issue and to start to think differently about how we use and manage our water supplies. And what you see here is a depiction of part of our core way of thinking about this, our core approach, that particularly in central Arizona, where part of the Central Arizona project water supplies are at risk if there's a shortage declared in the lower basin of the Colorado River. We have to start thinking about being able to manage and adapt with a smaller water portfolio. And we think a core concept for how to adapt with less supplies is to promote greater agility, equity, flexibility, creativity, resiliency, and sustainability. So this is part of what informs our work. I think the other point I would make, and I know you've heard this probably from other speakers, I'd make two other points about our vision. First, as Steve indicated in the lead-in, if we don't do some things across the lower basin, starting with the lower basin drought contingency plan agreement with Nevada, California, and the Bureau of Reclamation, if Arizona doesn't step up to that, the extraordinary conservation commitments of Minute 323 that you've heard about, the water that has been identified as available for the awesome restoration work that you heard about from Osvaldo Hinojosa in your last presentation, that water may not be there if we don't get the lower basin drought contingency plan agreement done and do some other things for the resilience of Arizona's water. And then the second point I would make around this slide and our vision is, as our good friend and leader Jennifer Pitt of Audubon has said, we know that in a crisis, the environment's likely to lose. So part of addressing these system-wide issues and taking on the hard issues of making the water system more resilient and more flexible, part of the reason to do that is so that we can avoid drastic cuts and avoid crisis and then get to the work of water for restoration and water for the environment. Next slide. So to some extent, I've covered that on the comments I've just made, that there are consequences if we do nothing with our water management and with the allocations of water from the Colorado River. If we do nothing, we're dealing with impacts to the delta and the inadequacy of water for restoration flows and directed flows in the delta. We know that Lake Mead's elevation will determine, both under current multi-state agreements and future ones, Lake Mead elevations are going to determine how much water comes through the Central Arizona Project Canal for use in Central Arizona. So bolstering Lake Mead's elevation and following up on the really great work that's been done over the last few years by CAP and other agencies. Building on that work to protect Lake Mead levels is really important. And then, of course, on the left side of this slide, destabilized economy. The last thing we want is mandated cutbacks and issued by a federal decree that could have both a really disruptive impact to economies in the region and would send the signal that Arizona isn't managing its water resources well for people and the environment. And that's a signal we don't want sent, and that's a reality we don't want to step into. Next slide. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to take a moment on this. The imperatives on the left, what are the policies and actions we ought to be doing in Arizona? And what should we be rallying to support as Arizonans who care about sound water management? What should we be thinking about? Well, first, it's minimizing and eventually eliminating unsustainable groundwater pumping. Second, it's broadening the number of users and interests that can participate in stabilizing Lake Mead and protecting supplies. And then thirdly, creating options for all water users to prepare for future water shortages through greater water sharing and flexibility. On the right, you see suggestions of policy reforms that could move us forward in all three of those areas. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next slide to wrap up my section, and so that we have time for questions. So legislative priorities. I know you've all been hearing to one degree or another about the governor's Arizona Water Solutions process, the governor's Water Augmentation Council, and really important work that the Central Arizona Project has been doing, both in supporting system conservation and also in board task force meetings to try to address the acute issues in the lower basin. What you see here is the consensus view of the four organizations plus Business for Water Stewardship. What we think the legislative priorities need to be in the current environment to move toward the vision we've articulated. Now, I would say that there are lots of ideas that have been discussed. Many of them are really important in terms of water policy. There are at least 26 issues that the governor's Arizona Water Solutions process has talked about. What you see here is a list of 6. I don't mean to say that some of those other 20 ideas are bad or unworthy. I think probably we have different views of different particular proposals. But our view is that in terms of what we need to get done now to move the state forward, that these are the most important proposals that are currently on the table that would move Arizona's water management forward for people and the environment. First, it's getting legislation that would authorize the Department of Water Resources to conclude that multi-state agreement called the Lower Basin DCP. Second, we think there ought to be ongoing system conservation programs to conserve water in Lake Mead. Again, to build on the conservation that has kept us out of shortage, the biggest volumes of which have been through work by CAP supported by ADWR. Thirdly, creating a program where Arizona tribes could decide to store part of their water in Lake Mead for later use. That's known in water legal circles as tribal intentionally created surplus. Storage of part of the tribe's water, reduction of consumptive use that's been occurring in a way that could be stored in Lake Mead for potential later use by tribes. Fourth, developing an Arizona DCP Plus plan where there's various conservation activities, including system conservation, that you'll be hearing more about from Amy, that allow the state to successfully implement the DCP agreement. Fifth, we think there need to be improvements to the Arizona Water Bank. We think it ought to have more autonomy, more assurance of access to funding, and we need more specific planning and environmental and sustainability guardrails on how the Arizona Water Bank supplies are accessed in the future. And then sixth, we are supporting a proposal by the Department of Water Resources to require all non-exempt wells outside of the AMAs and INAs to measure and report on groundwater pumping. So I think what I would say is, in our view, there shouldn't be any issue to distract us, and no side issue or conflict should keep the state from doing these essential steps to improve our water management portfolio and policy. Next slide. So now I get to turn it over to Amy McCoy, who has been a, shall I say, a transformational leader and consultant to a number of the organizations, both that you've heard about and that are on this call. So Amy, turn it over to you.
Right. Before you jump in, Amy, I just want to say thank you to Kevin for being there at the Capitol, speaking up for sound water policy, and thank you to everyone on the line for dealing with Kevin being at the Capitol, speaking up for sound water policy. So with that, yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, Steve and Audubon for hosting this webinar. I'm going to pick up the amount or where Kevin left off and talk about some of the projects that are in support of the legislative agenda and the other efforts that are being put forth by these groups. And I apologize because my office is right next door to the fire station, so I may mute when the fire trucks go by. So next slide, please. So one of the topics of water policy management that has been increasingly discussed in the past year or so is a term called excess water, which is an interesting term and bears a little bit of discussion on this call. We've termed it Arizona's resiliency water because this water has really supported Arizona over the past few decades in responding to a variety of different challenges. And what excess water is basically Arizona has an entitlement to Colorado River water of about 2.8 million acre feet. You'll see on the left-hand part of the slide. And that entitlement is divided in two ways. First, there's on-river entitlements, which are high priority, which is the water that flows down the Colorado River and is accessed between Lake Mead and the international border. The other portion of the Arizona entitlement is delivered to Central Arizona through the Central Arizona Project Canal. And that's about 1.4 million acre feet. These are not quite equal, but roughly divided in half. For each of those deliveries between Arizona on river and CAP, there is a portion of the water that is actively delivered and used, and a portion of the water that is not delivered. The portion of the water that is not delivered falls into a category of water called excess. And that excess water accrues to CAP. So the water that CAP has access to on an annual basis includes the entitlement plus the excess water from on river. And this bucket of water that's circled in red here is the excess water from on river, and then the excess water within CAP, the water that is entitled but not delivered. That then is this type of water that can be used for a variety of other uses that are not the contractual uses. So the next slide then. That water, which it varies from year to year, but on average is about somewhere between 4 and 550,000 acre feet, is divided up between agriculture, groundwater storage, and Lake Mead. And this excess water has been used over the decades for a variety of different purposes to solve or address various challenges. That people are increasingly looking towards to leave in Lake Mead. And the way that water is left in Lake Mead is through, next slide please, system conservation. So system conservation is, many of you I'm sure have heard of the term. It's basically a program that was started about 5 years ago as a pilot project that compensates water users for in order to leave that water in Lake Mead and bolstering elevation. It's essentially a proactive conservation effort to manage the levels of Lake Mead. Is based in this idea. Sorry?
We keep losing your audio.
Oh, you do?
And I'm not sure why.
Oh.
You sound okay now. Go ahead.
Okay. I was pacing, so I'll stand still. Maybe that will help. Like I'm standing, like I was speaking to all of you in person.
Cool.
So system conservation has been a relatively popular program. And it is rooted in this idea of fair compensation and proactive management. So it really has an advantage of involving water users in the management of Lake Mead and in proactively ensuring that we maintain the levels of Lake Mead so that we don't fall into shortage. It is the tool, one of the tools that we could use to stay out of shortage, because when shortage occurs and there are curtailments, those curtailments, of course, are not compensated. Those are just curtailments across the board. So using system conservation as a proactive tool it kind of engages everybody in Lake Mead management and offers everybody an opportunity to use their water both for their own purposes as well as towards the stability of the system. So there is a discussion, an ongoing discussion that our groups are involved in sort of what does the future of system conservation look like? And there's a few ideas around the structure of this program, including developing a funding source so that a variety of different funders, a variety of different funding mechanisms and actual sources of funds can go to system conservation. It would be open to the public, to public funders, to private funders, and to philanthropic sources. There is also a discussion about the criteria for projects. So what constitutes a system conservation project? How do you calculate those savings? How do you quantify those savings? And then how do you ensure that those savings accrue in Lake Mead on an annual basis? There's a discussion around involving more stakeholders in the governance of the program so that there is a level of transparency and a level of public discussion around both the funding and the water that goes to Lake Mead management. And then standards for certifying that conservation actually occurred and that the volume of conservation that was anticipated was the actual volume of conservation that occurred. Next slide, please. So an example of this conservation agreement, I'm sure many of you have seen, was with the Gila River Indian community this year. Earlier this summer, there was about $6 million that was contributed by the Bureau of Reclamation, the state of Arizona, the city of Phoenix, and the Walton Family Foundation to compensate the Gila River Indian community for about 40,000 acre feet of their 2017 CAP entitlement. And this was water that they were using for agriculture and for groundwater storage. They stopped using the water for those purposes and instead left that water in Lake Mead. I want to note that CAP supported the implementation of this conservation agreement by certifying that that water would remain in Lake Mead as an actual forbearance of water. And this type of project really, we feel like, sets a precedent for additional lower basin system conservation projects for a couple different reasons. First, because there were a number of different parties that contributed funding. There was an acknowledgement that the Gila River Indian community had this water that they could utilize and that they could stop using for their current purposes and leave in Lake Mead. They were compensated for it, and it contributed, like I mentioned earlier, about 40,000 acre feet to Lake Mead management. It was a very collaborative process, very open project, and also ultimately supported riparian restoration on the GRIC lands by acknowledging that water storage and groundwater recharge is an essential part of their groundwater management. So they themselves are shifting groundwater management to support this riparian recharge project, as well as supporting Lake Mead levels. And so I see that there's a bunch of questions coming up. So Steve, would we address those after the presentation?
It's entirely up to you. If you want to wait until the end to tackle them, that's okay. If you want to take care of them now, that's all right too.
Okay. Then why don't I just go ahead and wrap this next slide up?
Sure. And
then we can begin answering the questions.
Sounds good.
So if you turn to the next slide, it's actually the last slide. And I usually use this slide in my presentations because I love, first of all, the imagery, but also this notion that that the Colorado River and the water that we are, water management efforts essentially to protect Lake Mead are more than just a water supply and a water management effort. It's really also an acknowledgement that water and rivers form something more spiritual for us, more cultural for us, that they're an essential part of the lifeblood of this area. So with a nod to John Wesley Powell for this quote, I'll go ahead and pause here in the presentation because I feel like there's a lot of questions that I can kind of go back to. And it also looks like Kevin dropped off the line because I think he needs to move on to his meeting at the Capitol.
Cool, sounds good. Shall we start at the top of the question with, see who we got. Our first one was from Lisa Buchanan. And she is curious about evaporation in Lake Mead and asking, won't evaporation reduce the amount of water banked in Lake Mead over time? And how is the evaporation included in the equation?
Absolutely. So yes, there is a lot of evaporation at Lake Mead. And that is accounted for in the structural deficit. So right now, Lake Mead is over-allocated, which is to say that there's a greater amount of water leaving Lake Mead than going into Lake Mead. And it's to the tune of about 50% of the over-allocation includes evaporation. So I'm thinking of a way to put this. Let's see here, there's about 1.2 million acre feet of over-allocation a year. 600,000 of that comes from deliveries. So delivering more water than arrives in the lake to users downstream. And 600,000 acre feet roughly is from evaporation. So if we are to solve the structural deficit, we definitely need to take evaporation into account, which is to say that we need to reduce the deliveries out of Lake Mead by about 1.2 million acre feet a year in order to break even, to not overdraw on our account. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
Okay.
All right. That is a lot of evaporation. I'm kind of shocked the number is that high.
Well, you know, it's really interesting because Lake Mead is actually trapezoidal. So it's wider on the top and narrower on the bottom. So there's a little bit of a tricky puzzle, because the higher that Lake Mead gets, the greater the evaporation. There's a bigger surface area the higher the lake is.
Yeah.
And because it's, you know, it's very long, it's quite narrow, it's a huge part of water management is taking into account that evaporation.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. We got one from Trisha Girodet. There's no mention of environmental water in the legislative priorities, I think the ones mentioned by Kevin. I understand that the four groups think that the DCP and Lake Mead stabilization have to occur first. What would constitute a marker for either the state or the four groups to then ask water to the environment?
Steve, I apologize. My phone just blipped out as you were asking that last question.
Sure. I will read through it again. Give me 1 second. There's no mention of protecting environmental water in the legislative priorities mentioned by Kevin. I understand that the four groups think that the DCP and Lake Mead stabilization have to occur first, but what would constitute a marker for either the state or the four groups involved to feel comfortable to then ask for water for the environment to be considered?
Got it. What would be the guardrails and what numbers for what measurable items? It's an excellent question. So, and I should caveat this, that I am not on the front line of the legislative agenda right now. So I am going to answer this question, but I think it would be great if you have additional questions on this to follow up with Kevin. As far as what would constitute a marker for either the state or the four groups to feel comfortable to then ask for water for the environment. I think that the markers would be the adoption of the DCP itself, so that there is a basin-wide agreement to manage Lake Mead if it falls into shortage. That's basically the DCP. And it's very important that the DCP is signed in order to honor the part of minute 323 in which Mexico would also join in managing for Lake Mead levels. So it would be a collaboration between the three basin states and Mexico, as well as the Bureau of Reclamation. So I think the first marker would be that the DCP was approved and signed by all three basin states. The second marker would be that there is an Arizona-only agreement, which acknowledges the fact that Arizona is the lowest priority and that Arizona would be most significantly impacted if Lake Mead falls into shortage. So that there would be an Arizona-only plan that takes an even more proactive measure to maintain Lake Mead above shortage levels. Over the past year, it's been called a variety of different things, but I think it's most commonly referred to as the DCP Plus plan, which is the idea that Arizona water managers, ADWR and CAP, would, together with the BOR, do a series of calculations and models to project the risk of Lake Mead falling into shortage over the next 24 months or 2 years, and then calculate the amount of water that would need to be added to the lake in order to prevent that from occurring. And then Arizona would take measures to add that water to Lake Mead to prevent it from going into shortage. So I think the first two markers would be an approval of the DCP as a whole and approval of an Arizona-specific DCP Plus plan. Once those two plans are in place, then I believe we really are able to have a discussion about which water goes where, when, and for what purpose. And that, I believe, is where we have a robust discussion about the environment. So the answer, I think, to that question is first DCP, then DCP Plus. And then we engage in a discussion about how to utilize the water resources that we have at our hands to meet the multiple different needs that we have, which include human needs, environmental needs, and lake need needs. And as far as answering the last question there, what numbers, items, I'm not sure exactly what that refers to, but I do know that the idea right now that's being discussed is that there's an annual evaluation of the risk of shortage, and the volume of water that would be required to maintain Lake Mead above shortage level would be calculated on a 24-month basis. So there isn't a static number. It would be a responsive number to the conditions. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. Thank you for that, Amy.
What's that?
I think so. Thank you for that.
Sure, sure.
So we just got a couple of more, and I think they're all kind of along the same lines. The first one came up when you were talking about system conservation, and it asks that by water users, do you mean agricultural users? CAP takes care of municipal, urban for the most part, and which users are being incentivized?
So when I say water users, I'm typically referring, in the case of system conservation, to the entities that use Colorado River water, that receive delivery of Colorado River water by CAP. And those entities are the municipalities, tribes, and agriculture, as well as some other users around groundwater storage. But the users that can participate in system conservation are municipal users, tribal users, and agriculture users. So to the question, which users are being incentivized? I'm not totally sure about that question necessarily, the term incentivized, but I would say that the users that can be compensated are the municipalities, the tribes, and agriculture for system conservation efforts. So that would look like, for a municipality, doing some type of conservation project where water is, there are new water savings that are generated through some action, and that water then would be left in Lake Mead. For tribes, it's what I discussed with the GRIC agreement, where GRIC fallows some agricultural fields and changes some of their water management around groundwater storage, leaves that water in Lake Mead. And then for the agricultural users, it typically means fallowing a field or changing the cropping pattern or changing the irrigation on a field so that there is a measurable amount of savings. And then I saw a question a little bit later that I'll address, which is that system conservation is intended as an annual program. So for the year 2017, the Gila River Indian community put forth 40,000 acre feet to the system conservation program in the summer. That water remains in Lake Mead, and it is not, that water is forever in Lake Mead. It cannot be accessed later, which I believe is one of the questions. If a water user wants to access their water later, then they do a different type of agreement, which is called intentionally created surplus. And under that agreement, they would leave a particular volume of water in the lake that they would theoretically be able to access at a later date when the lake conditions are higher or more stable. They would not be compensated for that water because they would basically be storing that water for access later. And yes, for that water, there is a charge for evaporation. I think it's like 5% perhaps, is charged for evaporation. Ah, she said she got it. Okay, great, thank you.
deal. So it looks like the next one we have is from Carrie Meister, asking how can there be excess water when there isn't really 9 million acre feet coming down the Colorado right now? Isn't the 2.8 million acre feet allocation for Arizona now unrealistic?
That's a great question. So there's a couple different things going on. There's the water that was allocated under the 1922 Colorado River Compact. And those allocations are the allocations that we're working with right now. So that's where Arizona received its allocation from, is from that 1922 compact and the various different legal arrangements and lawsuits and contracts that have fallen out of that agreement or the compact. It is widely acknowledged and widely known that the volumes of water that were determined under the 1922 compact exceed the volume of water that's actually physically available on the river. This is where our structural deficit comes from. There is an over-allocation that is built into the way that the river is managed. So yes, the 2.8 million acre feet allocation for Arizona is, it definitely exceeds, once you combine it with all the other allocations, it contributes to the structural deficit. The challenge, of course, is that it's written into the law. And so what we're dealing with right now is a situation where our hydrologic reality is not really in line with our legal reality. And that is the crux of the issue that we're facing right now. Legally, there are particular volumes allowed or described under the law. Hydrologically, there isn't that much water. That's why we're coming up with programs like system conservation and intentionally created surplus, the DCP, the DCP plus. All of these are in response to the crux of the problem, which is a legal over-allocation on the hydrologic conditions.
Perfect. I like that question. It really underlines the whole reason we're talking today.
Yes, it is what we're up against.
Yeah. The next two, I think you've already kind of covered. They're asking how is stakeholder defined from, I think it was another system conservation slide. And you've already mentioned that those are the agricultural, tribal, and municipal users.
Yes.
One more. So what is the messaging regarding intended growth on the part of Arizona communities that are not built out for their city plans in the context of these strategies? Is there a danger that these arrangements could prop up unstable growth by keeping lake mead levels high enough to encourage the status quo growth in the West? Would these approaches only have a net gain for the environment if paired with some provision that growth not simply consume all of the water derived from these strategies?
Well, that's a meaty question, and a good one. I mean, it gets at the heart of growth, basically, when we've just acknowledged that our central challenge here is that our legal structure doesn't match up with our hydrologic reality. And I would say that there is not a distinct discussion about growth in these water management policies and the legislation right now. The discussion is really around how to manage for lake mead and where the water will come from and who participates in contributing that water. So I think this growth discussion is obviously connected and it's very relevant, but it is not nested within the legislative discussions right now. So I'm going to actually sort of sidestep that a little bit because I think that it requires a pretty robust discussion about, essentially living within our hydrologic means, which of course is the whole conversation that we're having right now. That's not a super satisfactory answer to the question, but I think it's a really good question, and important that it's, the discussion is informed by the water management strategies that are on the table right now.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, that's one that comes up a lot, that we're conserving water, but to what end and what will the ultimate use of that water be? I think it just underlines why it's important that we stay involved in these discussions as they move forward. Our next question. If you bank water, will one be able to withdraw from the same amount of water in the future? We covered that one.
Yes.
And one from Kristen Wolf, the missing stakeholders are, oh no, I lost it because the missing stakeholders of the rivers, the needs of the river are missing, but you say this will not be addressed until DCP and DCP plus are addressed. And I think the answer to that is just yes, that is the case.
Mm-hmm. But I would like to point out sort of a nuance of language here. That one thing I think that these groups and everybody gathered on the call today has really done a good job on is that language, emphasizing the fact that rivers are stakeholders, that rivers and the environment has a right to the water that flows through it. And to my thinking, what's interesting about that is that ultimately what we're saying there is that the rivers and the groundwater tables and the reservoirs and the lakes and everything else are the very things that support us. And for the most part, as you know, we've had a largely sort of one-way relationship with Lake Mead, where we've consumed water out of Lake Mead. So there's a reliance on the system without a sort of reciprocity of putting water back in Lake Mead to maintain it. And that's in some ways what we're talking about here with the DCP and the DCP plus is we've acknowledged that we're overdrawing on our account through the structural deficit. And we've acknowledged that we must give water back to the system. There's got to be sort of a reciprocal action to sustain the system that sustains us. And that, in some ways, is what we've been talking about with rivers all along, is that there must be an action, a reciprocal action to give something back to the thing that sustains us. So I think that the language around the DCP, the notions around the DCP and the management philosophies and management operations and actions that are taking place around the DCP are really important for the messaging around rivers as well. So I do think that they are linked because there is an acknowledgement, like I said, that the system that we rely on also needs our support. And that is sort of the grander picture here around Lake Mead.
Looks like we have just a couple more. It seems that the likelihood of less water in the Colorado River in the future, there is a likelihood of less Colorado water in Colorado in the future. So isn't it also likely that the excess amounts left in the rivers, such as in the GRIC agreement, will never be utilized? And if so, don't they represent more of a contribution to keep Lake Mead above 1075 that will never be recovered? That one's from Carrie Meister.
I'd be happy to talk to Carrie offline. I don't completely know if I'm grasping the intent of the question, but I will address one point of it, which is that the system conservation agreements as a contribution to keeping Lake Mead above 1075, they will not be recovered. Those contributions, those system conservation contributions, that's a mouthful, to Lake Mead are on an annual basis, and they remain in the lake. So that excess water that goes into the lake stays in the lake on an annual basis. And I don't know if that was the intent of your question, so I'm happy to chat with you offline if you'd like.
Good deal. Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me at all if there's any other unanswered questions. We'll be happy to get to you offline. Last one here. Where is the environmental water for minute 323 coming from?
It is very similar to 319. It's coming from a variety of different sources. The U.S., Mexico, and the nonprofit organizations are all contributing water to the environment through a variety of different means, including the Water Trust in Mexico, which is negotiating with agricultural users to dedicate water to the environment, and funding and a variety of different sources. And because I am not the expert on that, I would actually point you to Jennifer Pitt or Osfel for the specific answer to that question.
All right, it looks like that's it on questions.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate all the questions. It's actually nice to have a little bit of interaction on these webinars since I can't see anybody's faces. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Cool. Well, with that, I just have a couple of more things for you folks. If you just give me a second to switch presentations here. Just want to remind you that all of these webinars are available online at our Audubon Arizona YouTube channel. I have an arrow there towards the last webinar we did with Pro Natura talking about the direct habitat impacts of minute 323 and water in the Colorado River Delta. So if you missed that and want to put some of what we talked about today into context with birds, that's a great place to go. Secondly, if you check out the Audubon Arizona website, you will see an action alert directed at sending a letter to Governor Ducey and the Arizona Department of Water Resources, both thanking them for their part in getting us on to minute 323 as a state, and also asking that they take some critically needed next steps, those being working to develop the drought contingency plan and CCP+, as well as an in-state implementation plan for the agreement. So we'd appreciate you backing us up and taking action there. Lastly, just a couple of more links for you guys. If you are not a member of the Western Rivers Action Network, please sign up. I mentioned the past webinars. You can see the link for action opportunities, including the one I just mentioned. And then our events page where you'll be able to hear about what we're up to and future webinars. So with that, I think we're done. Give it a couple more seconds to see if any questions roll through. And I don't think they're going to. So thank you, Amy. If anyone's typing a question and I cut you off, feel free to just shoot me an email and we'll get to you. All right, thanks again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy.
Okay, bye-bye.